The 13th chapter. Darkness was just the gown the abyss chose to wear. On the day she divided her lightless mass before me, I was stunned at her true form. Everywhere I turned, she was there gazing back at me. Millions of eyes and fangs writhing around the light-swallowing void that was her mouth. The rest of her was a disgusting assemblage of fibrous muscle that consumed the horizon and all of the sky. Deicide. Upon awaking, the abyss dragged Deicide to his feet as if he were a life-size puppet. Disoriented by the slight increase in his dimensions, the first steps he took were measured and cautious. He closed his hands, cracking the knuckles of his great brown fists. As he flexed his muscles, he felt he could hear the tightness of the muscle fibers contracting beneath his skin. His tongue quivered inside his mouth, making him aware of the growth of several new teeth, like rows of saw blades. The abyss swirled around Deicide, admiring his completed physique, cooing and moaning as she made her inspection. In her eyes, Deicide could see his reflection. His irises remained like brilliant diamonds, as did the battle scars he received in his youth, ancient mementos of misplaced trust. Long ago, Knot had wanted Deicide to have his scars removed, but Hellmouth and Great White, who had many wounds between them, felt that their pup needed the reminders, and so along with the information of how to reassemble Deicide if he should pass, a string of code was set aside to reform him with a certain set of scar tissue. Many of the people that had taught Deicide his most valuable lessons had also hurt him a great deal, though he supposed he had done the same, perhaps greater. He could still remember Ecocide raking her claws across his face, her tears stinging as they fell into his fresh wounds. Stuffing the dark memories to the back of his mind, Deicide began to wonder about his location. The wet and rusted decay surrounding him did not appear as old as before. Suddenly he was made aware of the presence of his amanuenses routing eaters to his position, but he could hear booted feet attempting to slide silently across dusty and warped deck plates. The abyss absorbed the sounds that would seem non-existent to the sharpest hearing and echoed them back to Deicide's ears. Deicide spun slowly as a man in an old duster swung a lead pipe toward him. Before Deicide could fully face the man, the abyss had already disarmed him and began to peel open his carcass, as if his skin was the rind of some demonic fruit. The man screamed as his ribs were snapped from his spine. A gush of foul gray air escaped as one of his tar-filled lungs was torn open like a half-full vacuum bag. A warm pool of blood and urine was formed underneath the spectacle as the abyss began to devour the corpse noisily and carelessly, spattering the walls with blood. Several others emerged from the shadows, brandishing antique automatic weapons and hatchets fabricated from scrap. Deicide shifted into the center of this display as the guns began firing. A single umbilical swipe removed the lower jaw of a man who was screaming before him, and as the man gargled the blood in his throat, Deicide ripped his tongue out, nearly by the root. Then he whirled and vaulted over the man, gushing blood from the top of his neck. The abyss charged through the fray like a black tsunami, amputating limbs and absorbing hot bullets into her oily folds. Deicide reached out with his sharp fingers and plucked a collarbone from a man only to twirl and jam it into the eye socket of another. The jagged bone speared through the man's brain and shattered against the inside of his skull. The carnage on display reminded Deicide of the early campaigns he had led personally, when he lacked the numbers to discourage drawn-out wars. Back then, the only way he could convince a nation not to fight was to reveal to them just how horrible he could be. A sputtering battle cyborg peeled away from the shadows, and with the sovereignty inside Deicide's kill box, the cyborg fell upward and was impaled on a broken support beam high in the overhead. Then Deicide allowed him to fall back to the ground as he pressed the cyborg into a crumpled sphere. When he was finished with him, He looked like a wadded ball of aluminum foil. The hollows produced from the suffering band excited the wicked pair, making grins where there had recently been scowls. As a few of the men attempted to retreat, their path was blocked by the abyss. Childlike giggles from an array of voices emerged from her darkness. The abyss coiled around their bodies after she had gouged them to tatters, squeezing their pulverized, red innards out the ragged holes. One man, done with witnessing the horror, placed a pistol in his own mouth, only to have it torn away by Deicide. He smashed the gun in his fist as if it were made of putty. He clamped onto the man's arms and held him at arm's length, watching him shiver under his menacing glare. The abyss screeched an unintelligible noise, only understandable to Deicide. He remembered the horrifying future which lay before him, knowing that it was his weakness that had caused it. With teeth, he quickly tore open the man's throat, nearly decapitating him. His head hung to the stump of his neck by a few red ribbons. The abyss watched like a proud mother as Deicide chewed the flesh without reservation or shame. Tendrils surged from her black mass onto the carcass and gently pulled it away from Deicide, who had seemingly slipped into a maddening trance. Even with the halcyonic cider, Deicide still felt the cannibalistic urges, leaving him wondering what was awaiting him on this tenebrous path. He refused to allow someone to steal his empire because of his own complacency. According to Knott's words, saving the Yolopal meant allowing himself to listen to the voice he ignored the most, his own. His eyes detected movement, and he felt the abyss winding up the alien anatomy inside her lurid bulk. When Deicide heard the voices of his risk-eaters, he relaxed, and the abyss began to soften. As much as the abyss seemed like an individual entity, she was actually just a part of Deicide, linked within the hollows of his subconscious. The abyss acted as an external nervous and immune system, but the medical staff continued to propose that she was a cancer that acted in Deicide's best interest. She wrapped herself around his neck and slid down his shoulders and back, pouring herself to the floor, once more becoming a cloak. Deicide was agitated at the way she prominently displayed her mass. All except his head was completely draped in her organic cloth. Attempts to push her behind him were met with the choir of feminine giggles. The fabric turned to oil as he heaved her up over his shoulders, and she flopped back down on top of him. The older he became, it seemed, that he was chained to the whims of this tangible id. No longer was she the whispering umbra of his childhood. "Lord Deicide," Anita said. A group of risk-eaters peered carefully at the blood stains on the deck and mumbled amongst each other. Iker stepped out in front, just as medics on Deicide's personal staff rushed to the noble's side. Immediately they began tapping the bleed pits in his umbilicals, drawing samples of chemicals that had already circulated into his bloodstream. He was annoyed that the abyss stood aside so easily when Knott's colleagues muscled their way through. Deicide shooed them away once they had collected what was required for their ongoing research. His personal EMTs showed him much more concern and tact, while the extremist Sikaris watched in silence. "Shay's been borderline psychotic. Everyone was on call. No off days," Iker said. Deicide had never seen the man look so tired. In fact, they all looked frazzled. Most of them were probably not used to combing through the fringes, which was only comparable to wandering in a vast desert, no circulated air, or any other convenient facilities such as running water, or water period, depending on the length of time it was separated. "She didn't think I could handle myself," Deicide said. "You've been nearly gone a year," Iker said. Deicide rubbed the back of his neck as he stared at the ground. "Why didn't they just rebuild me?" Deicide said. Iker shifted on his toes. "They had not left orders to block the procedures," he said. Deicide shook his head. "Left orders?" His antennas were already blinking rapidly. Iker placed his hands on Deicide's shoulders. "What happened?" Deicide said. Iker shrugged. "She went into the machine. She told her staff to consider her terminated." Deicide pulled away abruptly. "And no one went in to get her?" "No one has access. Not even you," Iker said. "Then cut the damn door down," Deicide said. But Deicide already knew the answer to that. No one entered the machine itself. It was a single place on the ship that Deicide had never been able to explore, though it was supposedly connected to every major space within the ship and every district power plant. Everyone had been told the engineering plant of the Olopod was maintenance, but Deicide just knew that Nod had a special group of somnus engineers that controlled its functions, or had bred some deaf mutes to deal with the physical repairs. How could a plant not need a crew? But what of the early days? As far as Deicide could remember, there had only been rations for the two of them.